Good afternoon and welcome to my talk on adversary emulation in OT environments. So about 6 years ago, this pop-up appeared on a couple 100,000 different devices all over the world. And what was striking about this was not necessarily that ransomware was a thing, but just how broad and how much of the imagination of executive leadership it actually captured. Because the very next day, many of us were asked this question: are we secure? So the problem is that executives don't really want to have that nuanced conversation of culture, process, and tools, because ultimately, that is what is required to answer that question around, are we secure? What they want is that yes or no. Are we secure? That thing I read about in the Wall Street Journal, can that happen to us? Well, some of the realities of answering that question and getting to that yes or no is our people are strained. Us on the defense side, we have an operations group that is struggling to keep up at times. There's a lot going on. Process is not necessarily guaranteed. And the tools, including some of our very fine vendors, their tools may not do specifically what you expect them to do in your time of need. But that doesn't help us answer that question. The question is, are we secure? Because the executives are still needing that answer. So at OGE, about 5 years ago, we started down our path on adversary emulation. And there's a couple of reasons that we went down this path. One, we wanted to introduce some realism, and we wanted to be able to control that realism. And realism for us is we wanted to be able to test the low-hanging fruit. We wanted to be more specific and intentional with the things that we were going to test. We could not worry about those 0 days and those fancy things that we read on dark reading and stuff like that. We knew that there's a lot of block and tackling to get to before we got to this point. We knew we needed to be iterative in our improvements. There was not some silver bullet like Dale talked about. There was not this big, gigantic quantum leap forward for us. It was going to be a grind to improvements. Iterate, 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 over and over and over again. Learn our environment, get better. And we felt like we could do this as long as we managed the three things that we could control around scope, frequency, and complexity. Lastly, we viewed adversary emulation as an opportunity to develop our talent and develop our culture. Because I think we all will send people off to some really expensive training class and may not get everything out of it that we're expecting. Because those individuals come back to your environment with your tools, with your own nuances, and have to then adjust to that environment. So we figured, why not just skip that part and get straight to training in our own environment? So that's why we went there. Now, how did we get there? So our goal was to develop a process around it. And so it starts for us, like many threat hunting programs, around some sort of intelligence or a hypothesis of what could go wrong in your environment. We take that information, we develop our threat, we emulate that threat, and then we measure our tool response. We gather that telemetry. We review that telemetry, we adjust our tooling, update our CMF, update our processes, and then the last step is around automation of our response. This is the critical piece, is we're trying again to scale our people and to drive those iterative improvements. And if we could just reduce one step of that workload on our people, we can begin to address some of the concerns that we have around, are our people taxed? So what does this look like in real time? So it starts with some sort of CTI trigger. And in this case, we're going to use the ECANS ransomware. And ECANS was interesting because it was specifically targeting electric industry companies. And for us specifically, it had a couple of processes that we were kind of interested in. And so we said, this is a great opportunity for us to take this threat intelligence, convert it into an emulation, test our processes, develop our people. But we couldn't just say, take this CTI report that we got from one of our trusted vendors and do emulation. We had to translate that somehow. And the method that we chose is MITRE, because it makes a lot of sense. Our goal on our operations front is to move up that pyramid of pain, away from hashes, away from IPs. We wanted to go detect those TTPs. We wanted to push up. And so the way we got there is we started doing these translations. And so now members of our operations team, when they receive these intel reports, they'll actually convert it into MITRE tactics. We'll then build them into the emulations, and that's how we go and spin those up. And in this case specifically, the tip-off for us was around some specific processes in the report that we received. We wanted to go see if we can identify if a service is looking for those processes and then trying to stop those processes. We also looked at this masquerading, and so this is one of the very first emulations that we ran in our enterprise environment because we wanted to be able to answer this specific question, are we secure, when our executive teams were asking. So we run the emulation, we get our feedback out of our tools. Some tools, responded admirably. We got everything that we were hoping for. Some tools missed the mark. And that's, again, okay, because this is probably where you want to fail. This is where you can make improvements. This is where you can iterate. So we made those adjustments, and we created those automations. So everything's going great here. We're into the IT. But that's not really where we're ultimately trying to get. Because most of us, our crown jewels are in our OT environments. So how do we go from this enterprise IT environment towards OT for adversary emulation? So much like on the enterprise side, where we tried to put some structure and some governance and some guardrails around our activities, we wanted to do kind of the same thing, but more specific to our OT environment. And so for us, it began with, how are we viewing our OT environment? Now, as defenders, pretty much all of us here have seen the image here on the left around the Purdue model. The Purdue model is fantastic because it's a great tool that can be used to communicate defense in depth and what we're trying to do from a defensive perspective. But the adversary doesn't necessarily see it that way. The adversary sees it in areas of opportunity. And so what we try to do is create a translation between the two and say, all right, if I take Purdue, but I try to view it through the adversary's mind or eyes and say, like, how are they going to go and approach these problems? We are able to break the Purdue model down into three larger groups. IT, makes sense, beachhead, and OT. And upon really looking at this and thinking through this problem with some of our partners, we recognize that beachhead, that's really where we're out to defend. Or at least that's where our efforts should be until we're able to successfully defend the beachhead, and then we can probably move down more into the OT space. So that's all well and good. How do we get there? So the path to OT starts with just an evaluation of maybe our DMZ. I'm guessing most of us in this room have some level of DMZ, a space between your IT and your OT space. That's most likely where the adversary is going to try to communicate outbound from. So our first goal was, can we establish C2 in that environment? And so we took some MITRE tactics, we targeted some specific areas in our environment, and we tried to establish C2. And we were successful because ultimately, you give it enough time, you can be successful. But we learned some really great stuff along the way. Namely, we were able to test the efficacy of our AV, EDR, and firewall on specific threats. And that's hard to do, especially in this environment. So we now know that first entry into our beachhead, what specifically those tools are going to look like and how they're going to respond to threats. And then we started learning other cool stuff about our environment. Namely, when we tried to execute some C2 using HTTP versus HTTPS, we saw different behaviors. Now, I don't know how many people in this room have read the ICS Cyber Kill Chain written by Rob and Mike Asante, but there's a section in that paper where they talk about the importance of leveraging some of the complexities of your OT environment as a mechanism to defend, right? You have home field advantage. And so this is what we're building here. We think about that home field advantage thing a lot, and how can we leverage that home field advantage to be able to shake out the adversary faster or to perform those disruption activities that we need to. So we are identifying what makes our environment unique, how to leverage and take advantage of that, and in the meantime, we're developing talent, which is not, you cannot send anyone to a $10,000 a week class and have them learn about how your environment is going to respond to threats. So once we've established C2, we want to begin to turn our lasers inward. Because if we're the adversary, beachhead is just the first step. Now we're wanting to get closer into that OT. We want to actually start to get to a spot where we can impact operations. So this is the area we're targeting. And we're running pretty standard techniques. We're looking for connections. We're looking for system discoveries, information discoveries, real high-level generic access operations, because we're new to this. We're developing this muscle. We're trying to grow our organization's capability. But word to the wise, once you start facing inward, you are going to run a risk of impact, depending on how far down you go, depending upon the systems that you hit. And so this is where we pivot back to say, these relationships, the control of scope, the control of complexity, these are the things that are going to enable you to successfully test these environments, rather than just hauling off and running an automated emulation campaign where you're going to test all the things and you're going to beat up all your systems and then get a report and go work from that. Everything we're doing in this environment is very targeted, tightly scoped, reduced complexity as we grow and develop our own internal capabilities. So other emulation campaigns that we focused on was around our LOLBAS, because that's what the intel says. Intel tells us that adversaries don't need fancy malware because we're providing them all the capabilities that they need. And it's signed, and it's part of the baseline, and everything just works. It's all hunky-dory. So what we're looking for here through these LOLBAS activities is if we are able to say, I'm performing this activity that I know is malicious, I'm able to detect that activity, we now know the adversary has established some level of persistence and that they have command and control. And our shift then moves into a reduction of dwell time and a disruption of any stage 2 activity. Because in our opinion, if you're here, if you're already that far down in the environment and you're performing these types of activities, you're likely an advanced adversary that is seeking to move into some sort of stage 2, moving towards impact operations or readying impact operations. And so even our response, our process may adjust based upon the types of threats that we discover and where. But again, these are not things that you just wake up and do. These are things that you iterate towards. It takes a lot of discipline. It takes a lot of intentional effort to get to these types of capabilities. And so the big observation for us, too, is around just the data collection, the telemetry that we gathered. And we like to think that we have our own pyramid of pain on the defense side, because we're really good at logging all the things. Yeah, storage is cheap. Send that syslog stream over. We'll just dump it all. We'll do analytics maybe later. But what we see is we collect all the things. We alert on some of the things. We block a couple of things. And so how are we now moving up those TTPs? Or up that pyramid of pain, similar to with the other pyramid of pain, where we're moving from hashes and IPs up to the TTPs. Again, none of it is accidental. It's all intentional as we're driving towards that. And you guys are going to hear me beat up on this one. It's all manageable as long as you are taking care of the scope, frequency, and the complexity of your emulations. But we're at S4, and no one really wants to hear about access operations. We want to talk about impact operations. And so we've done a fair bit of thinking on this, and I hope I don't disappoint too many people with the ultimate result. But there are some impact operations worth pursuing, and I'll tell you why. Probably one of the most important things we're doing right now is we're building a new lab. And we're doing a new lab specifically to do impact operations, but not for the reason you're thinking. We're doing this fancy lab so we can start to develop the security culture of our ICS capability with our security people, because like much of you, we have IT security people that we're trying to transform into OT security people. We have OT professionals that we're trying to grow their security capability, and we're trying to develop the relationships that will ultimately pull us out of the fire in case one were to occur. Because going back to one of my first slides, the process will break down, the tools will fail you. Ultimately, it's the relationships that are going to help you recover from whatever you're dealing with. So, but let's just say we're going to go ahead and continue forward with our impact. So this is kind of what we would still consider to be an Axis operation, where at this time though we're directly going after level 1, level 0. We're doing kind of same MITRE tactics. We're reporting out, here in our lab environment, we would actually have the adversary attacking the units and stuff. And so I just wanted to take a pause on this one and say, like, we have struggled to identify that specific value that doing the adversary emulation on a level 1 or level 0 truly provides when you think about it in the context of all the other stuff that's going on. So when you think about the, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. When you think about all the different opportunities to improve across the various MITRE framework elements, just in levels 2 through 4, that is going to chew up all of your time. So in closing, and wow, I really burned through this one. So in closing, our adversary emulation activities have truly been focused on levels 2 through the DMZ. Our goal is to prevent access into that beachhead. Our goal is to reduce that dwell time, to disrupt any stage 2 activities. And we do aspire to one day get further down into level 1 and 0, but we think that there's so much runway here in the beachhead area that that's where our main focus has been. So in our wrap up, the people, the process, the tools, those are the things that are going to, that we're trying to develop and measure and grow through our adversary emulation practices. We really focus on managing what we can control, and everything we do is around iteration, continuous improvements and continuous iteration for our processes. So, questions?
So you mentioned scope, frequency, and complexity several times, but what did you really mean by that?
What do you mean?
So 3 times in the slides, you had scope, frequency, and complexity,
yeah.
And you just sort of noted it as an emulation, but what exactly did you mean for those 3 variables?
Okay. Yeah, so thanks, Bryson. I did just kind of cruise right by that one. Scope for us is defining the attack surface, or attacking what specifically we're going to be testing. So are we testing a specific system? Are we testing a specific collection of systems? What specific tactics, techniques, or procedures? That's generally what scope is for us. Frequency, there's some stuff that we try and do, quarterly with partners. There's some stuff that we try and do monthly, just amongst teams. And then we even have some processes where our security operations personnel run these emulations on individual virtual machines. And so their frequency is actually hourly, that they will go and run these like kind of mini campaigns against antivirus tools or EDR tools, just to kind of see what the different variations look like. And so as we change our frequency, that actually also adjusts complexity. So with a lot of adversary emulation tools, you can build kind of a sequence of events. And so you can get a really thorough and robust campaign, but the different measurements and the different things you're going to have to look at afterwards is going to be a lot for your teams to kind of digest and decompose. And so what we try to do is we try to limit the scope and limit the complexity, so that way we're testing specific capabilities and specific functions of our security stack. Does that answer? Okay.
So I'm going to ask a question that's going to sound a little cynical, and it's not meant to be. Sounds like the program that you've put together is really cool, and you're building out the next generation of professionals with this process. You're giving them the opportunity to really get their hands dirty and see how to protect things by seeing how to attack things. My question to you is, have you found as you've built this out that people are poaching your resources? And what are you doing about retention to ensure as you're making this investment that you're not just becoming the feeder for other spaces in the industry that, well, candidly pay more than utilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the general perspective of my team, and I don't necessarily want to speak for them, but I have an idea of kind of how they position themselves. They see this as continuous involvement with them, right? And that's not necessarily something you get everywhere. And so look, I'm blessed to have the quality of people working for me that I do. It's a really special group, and it's an intentional culture, right? So like I talk about talent development because for us, we really try to focus on the cultural fits and the people that want to come and grow. And look, man, we're an electric electric company. And so the likelihood of people coming and getting rich working at the electric company is pretty low. So the kind of people that we tend to recruit is kind of a different sort anyway. And at the same time, we're going to continue to pour into our people. And if they end up going and making somewhere else better, hey, that's great. Good for them. We can't be afraid to develop people for fear that they're going to leave. So, but that's easy for us to say because the quality of people that we've somehow managed to find and maintain is exceptional. And so I'm very lucky, but yeah, I totally understand that perspective.
Thank you.
Just to kind of add on to his question, I'm an Oklahoman, so to answer your question a little differently, he's building a culture and a team as an Oklahoman that there's a lot of jobs in Oklahoma, but he's building an environment where people may want to work, and he's helping keep that retention. I've known Ian for years, but I now live in Houston, Texas, and thank you for keeping my Oklahoma power on.
That culture's so good that he left.
Yeah, exactly. So the people that do work for him are working and staying and helping drive a mission-focused culture. My question to Ian, obviously you're not doing level 0, level 1 monitoring to the degree that adversarial emulation, to the degree that you can share. If you were a company looking to do level 0 adversarial emulation, where would you start?
Where would I start? If I wanted to get all the way down, functionally,
low-hanging fruit, where would you start? If you wanted to test something in level 0.
I'd probably, it depends on what the intel says, right? So I would probably start in, most likely our substations. That's probably be an area where I would go look at. Generation facilities probably as well. I think that those are going to be those are the big ones, right? I would start where I think that I could have the most value. But again, each of these processes are so different, right? And so this one sensor, I attack it in one way, it's going to respond differently than if it's in another environment, or at least it will show up differently, right? And so then I have to figure out that nuance between the two environments. But it would be I would look at what the intel says, and then I would look at the impact to the business and try and find kind of that happy medium. And probably the other one that I would think about is, where do I have relationships that will help me get into those environments and in a way take care of us if something goes sideways, because that could happen, right, if you're not careful.
So I don't know if this is going to be a longer question, but at a high level, are you using commercial tools, or are you guys doing build your own?
So I was promised to not talk about specific. I had to promise to not talk about specific tools. I will meet anyone out in the hallway that wants to talk tooling. But what I'll say is, we've gone through multiple tools. We've gone through multiple vendors, and it took us a while to find something that works for us. And we've looked at different stuff. The tooling question really is about the uptake of your people, right? So what do they like to use? We were lucky enough to find a tool that our team has actually taken up on, right? I think a lot of us have been through situations where we bought something, got it installed, and then it just withered on the vine, right? It never got used. But to answer the deeper part of your question is it homegrown or vendor-led? It's vendor. And the reasoning is that we talked a little bit about the perspective of defense versus adversary. We don't have that adversary perspective. I don't think that we understand it the way we think a third-party vendor may understand it. They're probably going to get it at a deeper level than how we get it. And so having that relationship to like help kind of sanity check us, and it's like, okay, here, let me tell you how adversaries are really working, right? That's valuable to us. And we're also, we got a lot of other stuff to do. So homegrown sounds great, and there's a lot of cool opportunities. And if I had the funding to do my own red team, like that would be really neat. But a lot of us don't have that. And so we got to find that kind of happy middle ground. So where we're at now is we've got this nice partnership, but it's led by my teams as they build out the emulations. They figure out what they want to test, and then they can go confer, come back, and run it through. And that's where we're getting a ton of value.
Okay, I'm definitely going to talk to you because we built it ourselves, and it's a pain in the ass to maintain.
Okay, yeah.
So if
I'll
you
be
got
right
a
out.
commercial solution,
Yeah. Man, you just totally validated my answer. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Hi, that was great. You talked a lot about training and using this as a training method as much as an end product. Along that process, are there certain parts of the process where you see the lights come on, where you see people actually get the risk and the challenge that you're trying to teach them to be alert to and to be motivated to do something about? Are there certain points in that process where you really see it happen?
Could you repeat that question one more time for me, please?
So as you're running your people through this process, are there certain points in that process where you see the lights come on, where they actually get the risk and you see that cultural shift in how they approach what's going on?
Yeah, I think it's, so what part of that cycle do they really seem to jump on? So I think it's measuring the response of the tools. Because I think we all go in and we say, wow, I'm spending a whole lot of money on X tool, and it's going to do all these things. And then you run this emulation, and you know that this process is ran, and you see it go through, and their firewalls logged it, but it didn't actually kick off an alert. It didn't block anything. You just see it go right through like Swiss cheese. And you start to have that realization, and I think this is for my new folks, like you have that realization like, oh my God, these vendors aren't blocking all the stuff they should be by default. Shocker, I know. And so that's typically where we see that first kind of voila moment. For my senior analysts, for them, I think it's seeing that repetition, right? Because all of us can do something once, but when they see it baked into a process and they see that continuous improvement, and like they've been around long enough to know it is the iterative, step by step by step improvements that actually will help you, create that defensible environment. Like that's where their voila moment is. So it's high touch. It's that kind of continuous nature of the process that they seem to gravitate towards. Thank you. That's a good question. Okay. Thanks, everyone.